Okay, hello everyone. I'm just going to quickly transition to my presentation. Okay. So who here has come across Wardley Maps before? Anyone? Okay, good. So hopefully from this talk, you'll get a bit of an introduction of what Wardley Maps are. So my name is Damon Skelhorn, if we've not met before. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, if you want to get in touch. And I also have a bit of a hobby, which is onlinewardleymaps.com, which is it's related to this talk, so I'll touch on that later on. So I came across Wardley Maps maybe about a year ago now, and it's only in the last maybe 4 to 5 months that I've really done a deep dive into it. There is a lot to Wardley Maps, so I'm actually still learning about Wardley Maps. So this is kind of my knowledge so far, and hopefully enough to give you an introduction to what Wardley Maps are. Okay, so Wardley Maps are a visual method of exploring, determining, and communicating strategy. So if you imagine a game of chess, you have a chessboard and you know the position of chess pieces and you know where they can be moved to. And Wardley Maps is about trying to give you that situational awareness, that view of the landscape, if you like, for other things. So anything that you want to be successful at, then you could apply Wardley Maps to. So Wardley Maps are the work of Simon Wardley, and he described himself as a once confused CEO struggling with change. And his kind of journey into Wardley Maps and what we know today began around 2 decades ago, after he was handed a document of strategy and he was asked if that strategy looked good. And he realized at the time he didn't actually know what a good strategy was or how to evaluate it. So since then, he's been trying to understand a way of trying to help with understanding what a strategy is. So what most people know of strategy is it's quite like storytelling or copying others or going off gut feel. So when we do that, we have to be mindful. What works for some people or a company in one context might not actually work for others because the context is completely different. And an example of that is probably the Spotify model. So a lot of people are copying the Spotify model because it was successful for Spotify, but there's probably a lot more to the Spotify model that is very unique to Spotify, and it might not actually work for another company. So it's all about keeping in mind the contexts are going to be quite different. So there's a lot more going on. And that's not to say that you shouldn't try and experiment with different things, different strategies, but just keep in mind that there is a lot more to it. So as I say, there's a lot more to strategy. Anticipation of change. An example of this is today younger people prefer to use social media, and it's quite likely that they prefer to use social media to make a complaint to a company or communicate with a company. So being aware of that change in how people are kind of operating today is something that you want to be aware of. Another thing is, what are your competitors doing? Are your competitors keeping up with that change? Are they allowing customers maybe to place orders through social media? Is that something that you should do or try and exploit? Another thing is inertia. So inertia can have an impact on strategy. So you might have a bias to things of the past because you've had a lot of success with that. But just keep in mind that what was successful in the past might not actually be the thing that you want to do in the future. So with all of this, there is actually something that can help. And mapping Wardley Maps is just one part of what we know as the strategy cycle. And the strategy cycle is made up of these 3 things, which is Sun Tzu's 5 factors, which is from the book Art of War. Some people might be familiar with that. John Boyd's OODA loop, and the 2 whys of strategy. So I'm going to focus mainly on the Sun Tzu 5 factors, which is purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, and leadership. And we'll go through this, and we'll just apply an example just to try and explain all of it and how it relates to mapping. So before we can actually get to creating a Wardley map, we need to understand what our purpose is. And this is the what and why, something that you do. So if you're a company, then it's likely that you want to sell goods to your customers. If it's a game of chess, then you want to win that game of chess. So it's understanding the what and why of what you're doing. And we'll use an example of a campfire coffee shop. So anyone who knows me knows that I'm a fan of coffee. And in the past, I've actually used one of these devices here that you can see, which is an AeroPress. So thinking about that and applying an example to this to explain Wardley Maps, the kind of scenario is that they've had a lot of success with the AeroPress, and they've had a lot of success with using a campfire to boil water on a kettle. So using the campfire to boil water in a kettle, which they can then use to make coffee. But in this example, they're actually struggling to cope with demand, and they need to understand what they should be doing next. So the gut feel might just be that they just need some more people to deal with the demand, or they might actually decide to build a larger campfire. And that's where having more of an understanding of the strategy cycle comes in. So rather than going off gut feel, assuming that you need more people or you need a bigger campfire, you can put a bit more thought into it to understand what you should be doing. So that's the what and why. We've got a campfire coffee. The purpose is to serve the best coffee, and they do that by boiling water using a campfire and brewing coffee using an AeroPress. So now that we understand the purpose, we move on to the next step, which is landscape. And this is the environment that you operate in. And this is actually where a Wardley map would actually come into play. So if you think about a traditional map, you have a compass, which is your anchor. With Wardley Maps, you need to have an anchor as well. When you look at a traditional map, you understand the landscape, the position of things around the environment. So you might understand where the motorways are, where the roads are, where your mountains are, the terrain. So having a map needs to be kind of visual, context specific, and it helps understand the features of your environment, their position, and any obstacles in the way. And you can also think about the chessboard as a map as well. So when you look at the chessboard, you can see the position of pieces, and you can see where they actually move to. And a Wardley map is about trying to apply the kind of same thing for strategy. So what makes up a Wardley map? So you need an anchor, which is your users. That's the people who consume the value that you produce. You need to understand or know what their needs are. Any prerequisites that are needed to meet those needs, the dependencies between those prerequisites. So what components depend on other components, and also understand the evolution of a component, and that's determined how a component manifests in the real world. So let's start to build a Wardley map. So who are the users for Campfire Coffee? They are customers. What are their needs? So they come to Campfire Coffee for a cup of coffee. And what's needed to meet those needs? So to make a cup of coffee, I'm going to need water, a kettle, coffee, an AeroPress, which is my coffee maker, and a campfire. The next step is to understand the dependencies between those components. So a campfire is needed to boil water on a kettle, which is needed to create a cup of coffee, which then the customer gets. At this point, it actually changes into a value chain. And now the next step is to start to think about the visibility of those components. So we start at the y-axis, which is visibility. And the idea is the higher up components are, the more visible they are to your users. If you think about an online e-commerce business like AO.com, you have your customers, which would appear right up at the top. The next thing that they would see would be the website. And then if you go through the value chain towards the bottom, then things that they won't see is the infrastructure that it runs on and the power needed to run that infrastructure. So that's how we kind of give the visibility. The next step is to add the x-axis, which is all about evolution. And that's determined by how a component manifests in the real world. And there are 4 stages to evolution. Those 4 stages are genesis, custom built, product, and commodity. So if you think about the early days of a computer, it was very likely that it was rare. There was maybe 1 or 2 around in the world. People didn't really understand what a computer could do. It's likely that it failed a lot of the time, and it was kind of expected. But as kind of time goes on, and as we understand what computers can do for us, they change a little bit. So now it's gone from 1 or 2 computers existing in the world to maybe a group of people in a garage creating computers. So a good example of that would be Apple, where they started in a garage, I believe, with Steve Jobs and Woz. And they were custom building these computers. As that component evolves, as that computer evolves, we start to kind of see it as more of a product that you would go to a shop, so they're mass-produced, they're built in factories. And if you look at the characteristics that make up, around this point, when a computer fails, it's a bit of a surprise. It's not something that you would expect. And then the final stage, commodity, is a computer. If you think about how at the minute you have a computer that you can buy from a shop, you can actually now use AWS to get a virtual machine, and it's becoming a commodity as a service. And I think you can draw parallels to the stuff that Craig's been talking about, how you've got 3D printing. It's likely that it's going through these stages of evolution. And you've got Craig custom building R2D2s. So who knows, in the future, you might actually be able to get one off Amazon if it becomes a product and it's something that people kind of want. There's more demand for it. So that's the stages of evolution. So now we're going to try and make it into a Wardley map that, if you're familiar with, this is what it kind of looks like, where you've got the y-axis and the x-axis across the bottom. We have genesis to commodity. So we'll start to create a Wardley map now. And the first thing that we do is to add the anchor, which is the customer, and the customer is right up at the top there. The next step is to add the needs of the customer. So the customer comes to Campfire Coffee for a cup of coffee. And if we think about the stage of evolution of a cup of coffee, it is a product. So you could go to Costa Coffee, you could go to Nero Coffee, Starbucks. It's quite an accepted thing. You go and you buy a product, a coffee product. The next step is to start to add all the components. So the first prerequisite that I need to add to a Wardley map to make a cup of coffee is the coffee maker itself. And I've added it here in the product kind of space and a little bit to the left compared to a cup of coffee. And the reason for that is I'm using an AeroPress, which is quite a niche thing. Many people may not have heard about an AeroPress. And if you compare that to maybe like an espresso machine, that would be more towards the right. But it's still a product that you could buy on Amazon. So the next thing to add is coffee, which is a raw material. So regardless of the brand of coffee, it's just probably coffee at the end of the day. Unless you're really into coffee, you're not really going to distinguish the difference. So we class that as a commodity item. The next one is a kettle. So a kettle, invented around the late 19th century, and apart from becoming electric, it's not really evolved that much. I think kettles these days, you might be able to connect them to the internet and use apps, but in general, a kettle is a kettle, it's not changed. So that's more of a commodity item. And a good way I like to think of, is it a commodity, is to understand if the brand makes a difference. If it doesn't make a difference, then really it's probably a commodity rather than a product. The next one is to add water. So when I boil a kettle, I need to add some water. And again, water is a raw material, been around since day dot. It's not really changed, so it's a commodity. The next step is to add the campfire. So if I need to boil a kettle, I need to add a campfire, and I put this in the custom-built space. So whilst the idea of a campfire has been around for a long time, cavemen were probably making campfires, in this context, I'm custom-building a campfire every time, similar to how R2-D2 here is getting custom-built by Craig. So I've classed that as custom-built. So now we've got a Wardley map. We understand the anchor, the needs, prerequisites, and how they're all dependent on each other. We can now move on to the next stage of the strategy cycle. This is the climate. And the climate is the forces that act upon the environment, and that can include your competitor actions. It's the rules of the game as well. A good example of this is how everything evolves. So we talked about how a computer has kind of evolved over time. It's likely that pattern can apply to everything. So 3D printing, that could evolve. And as they evolve, they also enable higher order systems. So this is another kind of pattern that you can see. So if you think about the computer that we know today, that's more of a product and it's gone to a commodity. That's allowed the internet to kind of come about. That's also enabled mobile phones. The internet's enabled e-commerce. So these kind of components, as they evolve, as they shift to the right on the Wardley map, they allow other things to emerge that build upon things that have evolved. So that's something to keep in mind. So climate, there's a lot of patterns that you can think about and apply. So for my example of campfire coffee, I'm going to focus in on these three here around inertia, how success breeds inertia. Inertia increases the more successful the past model is, and also inertia kills. So in a nutshell, the more success we have with something, the more resistance and bias we have against changing it. And I like to think a really good example of this is Blockbuster Video. So hopefully many people in this room know about Blockbuster Video, and you're not that young. So if you don't, it was around before Netflix. You actually went to a shop, you got a DVD, and if you're really old, you got a VHS, which is a tape. And Blockbuster Video did attempt streaming, but the core business was not around kind of renting DVDs. It was actually around late fees. And late fees for Blockbuster Video added around $300 million a year to the company's revenue. And around 2004, they started to struggle with decline, and they decided to scrap late fees. And the profit the next year was expected to be flat. So like I say, Blockbuster did make attempts to get into the streaming kind of capability industry. However, for Blockbuster, it was too late. They were too focused in on late fees. So for Blockbuster, inertia killed them. And I also think you can see the same thing going on today. So HMV, if you read the news about HMV, that's kind of a similar thing going on where people are moving to more streaming music. And it's becoming more of a niche thing to own maybe a CD, or I think that they focus more on vinyl these days. And that's kind of an example of how a company can just get stuck in their ways and, not keeping up with the change around them. So the next step of the strategy cycle is to move into doctrine. So doctrine is a little bit different than climate. And we like to think of these as the standard ways of operating. So you can think of this as the training of your people. An example would be in military. Your soldiers need to understand how to fire a weapon, and that understanding of how to use a weapon could be used regardless of kind of the context, the environment that they're in, and it's not context specific, so it could apply regardless of your context and your environment. If you think as training using a gun as doctrine, then if you're familiar with military, then cover move would be a climate pattern that you could apply. So that cover move would be very specific to the context and the landscape that you're in, whereas training a weapon, it applies to kind of all of that, all of the contexts. I like to think as well, if you're a software engineer, a design pattern maybe is probably doctrine, because you can apply that in many languages. It's not specific to a language. So there are many patterns that you can apply, and similar to climate, I'm going to focus in on these three. So I'm going to focus in on user needs, removing bias and duplication, and to optimize flow or remove bottlenecks. So keeping in mind these patterns from doctrine, from climate, so inertia and these three patterns here, I can then go back to my Wardley map that I created previously and start to apply these patterns and see what kind of effect it could have. So if I'm to focus in on the user needs, then really do they care that I use an AeroPress to make a cup of coffee? If I'm to remove bias and duplication, then I'm really biased to using a campfire to boil a kettle. Don't know why. And the same for using an AeroPress to make a cup of coffee. So I need to be mindful that whilst they worked for me in the past and I'm successful today because of that, maybe it's not the thing that I should be doing in the future. And I also want to optimize flow and remove the bottlenecks. So I've never done it, but I imagine making a campfire is quite time consuming. And also, I imagine using an AeroPress for every single customer that comes through the door is going to take a lot of time. So I need to focus on optimizing that flow so I can get as many customers through as possible. So I'm not creating queues. So now that I understand the landscape, the patterns that I can apply from climate and doctrine, I now actually come to the real part of deciding what I actually should do. And considering everything, what I should do should be context specific, and it needs to take into consideration what I'm here for, what my purpose is as a company, the landscape, the climate. So now I can consider my strategy. So if I go back to the map, I've highlighted here the coffee maker. So I've had a lot of success with an AeroPress, but if I look to my competitors, which is another pattern that you can apply, are they using AeroPresses or are they using industrial coffee machines? It's likely they've got these big espresso machines. So if I did make a change from an AeroPress to an industrial espresso machine, what impact would that have on my map? So you can see here that I've crossed out the campfire. So I no longer need to make a campfire to boil some water in a kettle. I no longer need a kettle because the espresso machine is able to do that. So you can see here that the map changes and there's a new dependency from the cup of coffee to the coffee maker, and from the coffee maker to coffee to water and to power at the bottom. So that's my kind of strategy. So using Wardley Maps, using the patterns from climate and doctrine, my strategy would be to replace the AeroPress and the campfire with an espresso machine. So that's quite a bit of a crazy example to apply, but hopefully it explains how you can use Wardley Maps to help with strategy. And I mentioned right at the start that I have a little bit of a pet project. So I don't get to do much development anymore, but I do like to keep my skills up there. So you'll be happy to know that I created this kind of tool where you can create your own Wardley Maps, but you can do it in a really easy way where you type the contents of what your map should have, so the components, the title, the dependencies between those components, as basically plain text, and then a map just gets generated over on the right, and you can use that. So if I go back to my example of campfire coffee, I've decided that I need an espresso machine, but that should not be the end. So strategy is quite iterative. You should be going through the cycle many times. So if you've made a change, you want to understand how that's affected your world, and you want to go back through that cycle again. So it might be that I was successful in the past because of the campfire. Maybe customers were coming to campfire coffee because of the campfire, but maybe not the way that I used coffee. So once you've been through the strategy cycle once and made a change, you kind of want to observe what's happened, the impact that has had, and then go through the cycle again. So in a nutshell, that's Wardley Maps and the strategy cycle. It is only a little bit of what Wardley Maps are. There is a lot of resource on the internet, specifically from Simon himself. So he's created a book that you can read for free. It's on Medium. There is a good website called evolved.hiredthought.com. And this has all the cheat sheets that you can look at, and it explains all the different patterns that you can apply. You can follow Simon on Twitter. He likes to tweet a lot. And you can also use the tool that I've been making as well. So I'm mindful of time. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to take it in the interval. But thank you very much.